So, with that said, I will read the paper. So it should be about 40 minutes or so, and then I look forward to talking about Tanabe, hearing your thoughts. All right. Absolute critique in Tanabe's philosophy as metanoetics. So in this presentation, I explicate the concept of absolute critique in the second chapter of Tanabe's philosophy as metanoetics. Because Tanabe conceives of his philosophy as metanoetics as a further development of the spirit of Kant's critique of pure reason, philosophy as metanoetics is a post-Kantian philosophy whose central tenets can be well motivated through a close analysis of his relationship to Kant's philosophy. Tanabe is explicit that metanoetics is the result of the critique of pure reason. Quote, metanoetics is the inevitable result of philosophy pursued as the critique of reason. Accordingly, I refer to metanoetics as absolute critique, close quote. So that word critique is a reference back to Kant. Absolute critique is a radicalization of Kant's critique of pure reason, for it is not only a critique of pure reason, but a critique, as Tanabe will tell us, of the critique of pure reason. Furthermore, because his concept of other power, tariki, is central to Tanabe's concept of absolute critique, I not only want to explicate how the practice of absolute critique engenders a commitment to other power, but also elaborate on the very meaning of other power in Tanabe's philosophy. So long before the appearance of philosophy as metanoetics, first published in 1948 after Tanabe's retirement from Kyoto University, Tanabe had been deeply engaged with Kant's philosophy in both its practical and theoretical dimensions. As early as 1918, Tanabe published a short essay entitled On Kant's Theory of Freedom. This text was followed by further works on Kant, including Kant's Theory of Teleology from 1924, in which Tanabe offers a critique of Kant's concept of teleology. According to Takeshi Morisato, I'll be citing him the whole time. So I have him right here. I'm sorry, but he's our local Tanabe expert. He knows a lot more than me. So any questions I can't answer, I'm just going to funnel right here to this guy. Okay, as Takeshi says, wait, where was I? I just got distracted. Yeah. Listen. According to Morisato, here we are. I'm quoting you. We're not quoting you. Tanabe's engagement with Kant was spurred by his mentor and colleague, Nishida Kitaro, who insisted that his younger peer should continue studying Kant. As Staton points out in his commentary appended to the English translation of the 1918 text, Tanabe's interests lie closer to the spirit rather than the letter of Kant, and this will become very obvious, especially to you, those of you who know Kant, that it's the spirit, not the letter. The minute the letter comes up, he's in big trouble. As our analysis will make clear, this observation continues to hold good until the very end of his career, from 1918 through Philosophy as Metanoetics. Now, because absolute critique constitutes the theoretical side of metanoetics, our analysis of absolute critique will focus solely on Tanabe's engagement with the spirit of Kant's theoretical philosophy. Although absolute critique turns the critiquing subject into the object of critique, Tanabe nonetheless remains truthful to the spirit of criticism in Kant's work. However, a brief glance at the secondary literature on the issue indicates there is significant disagreement about how to conceive of this spirit of criticism in Tanabe's work. According to Robert Carter, Tanabe's critique of traditional philosophy relied on faith, not reason. However, we find the opposite in Heisig, who proclaims that as a philosopher, Tanabe was nothing if not a system builder, whose method of argumentation is properly philosophical. So on the one hand, Tanabe's critique of reason is read as denying the truth of reason. On the other hand, he's simultaneously lauded and praised as a philosopher who systematically employs reason as a method for attaining the truth. Rather than affirm one side of the opposition at the expense of the other, Tanabe's philosophy endorses the truth of contradiction, such that reason is constituted by its capacity for self-transcendence. Through unraveling the concept of absolute critique, we will uncover exactly how the truth of reason lies in its capacity for self-transcendence, a self-transcendence that engenders a renewed sense of philosophy. Okay, part one, the critique of pure reason as an exercise in self-power. If absolute critique is a critique of the critique of pure reason, any elucidation of the absolute critique first requires an exegesis of Tanabe's conception of the critique of pure reason. The task of Kant's critique of pure reason questions reason's capacity to make claims about being, more specifically about what is in itself. Criticism is opposed to dogmatism. Dogmatism directly inquires into what is, without first inquiring to whether reason has the capacity to know what is. In his Critique of Pure Reason, Kant aims to set limits on what reason can and cannot know. Any Critique of Pure Reason attempts to impose limitations upon reason's legitimate use. Because one who engages in the Critique of Pure Reason employs their own reason to set limits to itself, the Critique of Pure Reason is an exercise in self-power, jiriki. Reason, by means of its own power, aims to set limits to itself. For this reason, Tanabe characterizes Kant's critique as an exercise in self-power. Having successfully set the limits to reason by means of reason, Kant argues that one ought not transcend those limits which reason has set for itself. For Kant, a priori concepts reside in the understanding, and these cannot be applied beyond possible experience to the absolute, to the noumenal, what is in itself. Indeed, even apart from Kant's analysis, and even on formal abstract grounds, this appears to be a very reasonable restriction on conceptual knowledge. For concepts traditionally conceive only enable relative knowledge. Tanabe and Kant both assume that concepts are finite. Concepts, their applications and judgments and syllogisms, which combine judgments together, can never transcend disjunctive knowledge. Because the meaning of every concept excludes some other meaning, the truth of any concept is never all-inclusive. When I conceive something determinate, mu, and conscious to some other conceptual content, not mu, that it precludes. Whatever I am able to conceive via conceptual thinking always leaves something unthought, unconceived. Finally, neither contests the traditional position that the principle of non-contradiction governs conceptual truth. Notice the qualification, conceptual truth. Indeed, both Kant and Tanabe seem to be committed to the finitude of concepts, a thesis that is at least consistent with Kant's critique, whereby concepts only apply to the phenomenal world and fail to have absolute significance. Although Kant's critique is a critical philosophy, Tanabe thinks there's a latent dogmatism in Kant's thinking. As a result, the spirit of criticism in Kant's critique is not fully realized. So what is this dogmatic assumption Tanabe wants to find in Kant? Kant subjects the dogmatic use of reason to critique, from the Greeks to the moderns, from Plato to Hume. Indeed, Kant is to be lauded for this. He's one of the great, one of the holy four, I would say. If you want to know who the other three are, I'll tell you later. Okay. In order for Kant, you can guess, and then if you're right, I'll buy you a beer if you're of legal age later, okay? The holy four.
Everything is legal here.
Okay, well.
It's UK.
It's the UK, yeah. It's my American puritanicalism. Sorry, I'm very, yes. You might expect me to say Holy Trinity, but instead it's a Holy Four, as Kant's tables always has four in them. In order for Kant to employ reason to set the epistemic limits for reason, Kant must assume that reason, by means of its own power, is able to set its own limits. Tanabe raises a question that Kant doesn't seriously raise, according to Tanabe. Can reason, through its own power, set its own limits? Because this assumption is not critically evaluated, Kant's critical philosophy contains a latent dogmatism. As Morisato notes, Kant never comes to question self-critically the possibility of the critique of reason itself, close quote. According to Tanabe, even though Kant considered the emergence of critical philosophy to be the distinguishing mark of his age, he did not expose his critique of reason itself to criticism. Indeed, Kant holds that reason, through its own self-power, can draw the limit of reason, and even though reason is disposed to transcend those limits, that's just our inherent striving, Kant assumes that such a procedure can be achieved without overstepping those limits that reason draws. As Kant observed, we have an inherent disposition to make our reason absolute. Indeed, this is one explanation for why metaphysics continues to persist in the 21st century. Even though influential 20th century traditions within analytic philosophy offered their own substantial critique of metaphysics, such as logical positivism and ordinary language philosophy, in the 21st century, metaphysics is stronger than ever within the analytic tradition. From David Lewis's Plurality of Possible Worlds to Schaeffer's Problem of Metaphysical Grounding, we cannot help, always and again, to fall back into metaphysical quandaries. And Kant can tell us why. He's not happy about it. Because Kant's critique of pure reason is not thoroughly critical, the critique of pure reason must itself become subject to critique. As Morisato notes, the term absolute critique indicates, quoting him, a critical stance mostly aimed at Kant's critique of pure reason. I was basically reading him the whole time, making sure that what I said was consistent with his book. Kant's critique is relative because it levels its critique towards dogmatism, but not towards itself. A critique becomes absolute when it subjects itself to critique, when everything is subject to critique. The critique of reason attempts to set limits to reason by its own self-power. This limit should specify the absolute difference between what reason can know and what transcends reason. Because Kant dogmatically assumes that reason can set its own limits, Tanabe directs his critique towards the concept of self-power. This is all Tanabe language. Tanabe asks the critical question: can reason successfully draw the limit between reason and what transcends reason by virtue of its own self-power without falling into contradiction? Whenever one attempts to draw the limit between reason and what transcends reason, one must know what is excluded from the domain of rational knowing. As Wittgenstein wisely indicates in his preface to the Tractatus, because one can only know the limit by knowing what is excluded, whenever one knows a limit, one inevitably oversteps that limit. Since reason attempts to know the limit between reason and what transcends reason via its own self-power, it can only know the limit by knowing what is beyond the limit. However, what is beyond the limit is that which transcends reason. Thus, by drawing the limit between reason and what transcends reason, reason oversteps its own limit, and reason knows that which transcends reason. However, this is a contradiction. Reason cannot know what transcends reason. Tanabe is not wrong that any attempt to relativize our capacity to reason inevitably absolutizes it by applying concepts to the absolute, concepts such as what is subject to limit or the transrational. Even the concept of the limit appears to be absolute, for it applies to both the rational and what transcends it. This is one of the main arguments that everything else will depend on. So if you have this argument clear in your mind, then everything else in principle should be understandable, but despite all of the twists and turns. If reason knows both the rational and the transrational, then one has not yet encountered the ultimate limit between reason and the transrational. Instead, one is only thinking on one side, the rational. Rather than discovering the ultimate limit, one is simply working within the domain of reason itself. Indeed, rather than think the limit between the rational and the transrational, one has only thought a particular limit within the domain of reason itself. One might argue that there must be another limit, phi, outside of the first limit, delta, such that phi constitutes the true limit between the rational and transrational. However, when reason thinks the second limit, phi, one only reiterates the same problem ad infinitum. For this second limit is not structurally distinct from the first. In order to know the limit, one must know what transcends it. Here again, reason knows what it cannot know, what is impossible and forbidden. Tanabe concludes that whenever one attempts the critique of pure reason, one draws the limit between reason and what transcends it. However, this leads to contradiction. Reason conceives what cannot be conceived, thereby rendering the conceptual non-conceptual and the non-conceptual conceptual. Moreover, every attempt to escape the contradiction by imposing a new limit simply engenders an infinite regress, such that at each step another contradiction of the same form is generated. Reason, by its own self-power, cannot consistently draw its own limits. To the contrary, reason can only consistently find relative limits. The only consistent critique is a relative one. In fact, this result makes good sense, for reason, by means of its concepts, only seems to be able to know what is relative to something else. The absolute, however, is neither relative to anything, nor does it stand in relation with anything, nor does it oppose anything. The absolute, whatever it is by itself, or as our esteemed Greek ancestors said, auto kath auto, itself by itself. Reason, via its own self-power, always only arrives at relative limits. As a result, Kant's critique of pure reason could never have been an absolute critique for Tanabe, for any critique of reason that operates through self-power of reason can only arrive at relative limits. However, Tanabe is neither satisfied with relative limits nor with relative critiques. To conclude, Tanabe insists that reason can only draw its own limits at the high cost of its own consistency. Reason, by relying on itself alone, cannot consistently draw its own limit. Okay, so I said in conclusion, but it's only page 8. Okay. Having elucidated Tanabe's critique, like in conclusion, I should be more careful about my use of signposting or something. Having elucidated Tanabe's critique of the critique of pure reason, we're now in a position to enumerate the necessary conditions for any successful critique of pure reason. First, every critique of pure reason that relies upon its own power must achieve two things, and these are mutually exclusive. First, it must delineate the limit between the transrational and the rational. Second, in order to achieve this end, it must make a claim to absolute knowledge. No critique of pure reason can succeed unless reason knows what is on both sides of the opposition. Naturally, this would constitute absolute knowledge, for there is nothing beyond what exists in the domains of the rational and the transrational. As we noted above, these two conditions stand in contradiction with each other. One cannot successfully limit rational knowledge to one side of an opposition, while at the same time proclaim reason to possess absolute knowing. Any claim to absolute knowledge violates the limits that reason has set for itself. Thus, the critique of pure reason can only succeed by failing to succeed. It can only draw the limits between reason and the transrational by violating that limit, by making a claim about absolute knowledge and therefore simultaneously effacing the limits that it draws. Therefore, if the critique of pure reason can only set its own limits on the condition that it transcend its own limits, it cannot successfully set its own limits on its self-power alone or by its self-power alone. In this sense, Morisato writes that philosophy cannot stand on its own reason alone. Close quote. If reason cannot set its own limits by its own power alone, we are poised to ask a new question. What is the power in virtue of which the limit of reason is posited? So now we're going on to other power. Okay, part 2. Reason fails to critique itself. It cannot set its own limits. By relying on its own power alone, reason can only set its own limits by simultaneously violating those limits. Although reason is not able to set its own limits, this does not detract from the fact that it is limited. But why is reason limited? There are probably no Hegelians in the room, but I have to answer myself, because that's me asking a question at the table. If you want to talk about Hegel's objection to Tanabe, or Tanabe's objection to Hegel, we can in the discussion. I've taken that bit out. Also, the references to Schelling I also took out of the paper, because it's neither here nor there. Reason's capacity to know is limited, because there is something reason cannot know. Every time one attempts to think the limit of reason, one falls into contradiction, and contradiction is a violation of the principle of reason, namely the principle of non-contradiction. Thus, reason cannot know the limit of reason. It cannot be infinite. With this experience of the finitude of reason, namely, reason is not able to set its own limit. That is a limit that reason experiences. Tanabe raises a new question. What is the origin of the limit of reason? So far, we've only given a negative answer. Reason is impotent to set its own limits. That's the limit of reason, is that it's not able to do that. That is its limitation. Our inability to do what we just tried to do is the limit, is the experience of reason's finitude. So we have to start with that. That's really important, actually. Because if you don't see this, then you might wonder why is it really limited. Tanabe's concept of absolute critique implies a commitment to other power. The question, what is the origin of the limit of reason, offers a key to unlock the connection between the concepts of absolute critique and other power. We know that the only way for the critique of pure reason to set its own limits is by having absolute knowledge. For the knowledge of the limit implies a knowledge of both sides of the limit, reason and what transcends it. Indeed, the limit itself is the point of contact between both, a point that reason encounters as a contradiction. Reason's inability to set its own limits by itself is correlated with its inability to know the absolute. Because the absolute is all-encompassing and reason does not know its own limit, reason fails to have absolute knowledge. Moreover, because knowledge of the limit would constitute absolute knowledge, for the limit encompasses both reason and what transcends it, reason's inability to know its own limit directly implies a lack of absolute knowledge. However, with the receding of the absolute comes its revelation. It is exactly because the absolute recedes from reason's grasp and transcends it that the absolute appears to the rational agent as that which is other to reason. In virtue of its experience of its own finitude and its own failure, the absolute appears as that which is other to reason. Hence, the absolute is that which transcends reason, the transrational. Metanoetics, as Hajime writes, quote, attempts to show the irrational core at the heart of all philosophical thought, close quote. Every time one attempts to conceptualize it, what does the absolute do? The absolute negates reason. Every time one reasons about it, reason is negated. Thus, the absolute is not only the transrational, he calls it the great nay, the great no. The absolute is the great negation. Because no conceptualization succeeds, the absolute transcends every determinate concept and every determinate being that would correspond to such a concept. Thus, Tanabe, in good Kyoto school style, conceives of the absolute as absolute nothingness. Again, if the absolute failed to negate Tanabe's concepts, reason could, in principle anyway, achieve the critique of pure reason on its own self-power alone. However, this is impossible. The absolute inevitably appears as the great no, and it appears as such in the experience of reason's failure. The absolute is other power, for it is one, power of negation, and two, that power which is other to reason. The absolute is the other power which altogether transcends reason. As we noted above, the impotence of reason to set its own limits is itself a limit of reason. So what is the origin of that limit of reason? Because reason cannot set the limits by its self-power alone, we know reason is not the origin of the limit. Reason is not responsible for the limit. However, the limit exists. So how is it possible? That's the Kantian kind of style question. We know the limit exists because we are impotent to draw that limit ourselves. The impotence of reason to draw the limit is itself the limit of reason. So what is responsible for the fact that the limit is drawn? It's a cool question. That which is responsible for the limit can only be a power other than our reason, other power. Tricky. By negating the power of reason, other power limits reason, thereby positing the limit that reason cannot set for itself. Absolute critique, the critique of reason, engenders not only the failure of reason to set its own limits and to know the absolute, but also engenders an experience of the absolute as the other power to draw the limit which reason is impotent to posit on its own. Tariki must be the principle in virtue of which reason is impotent to draw its own limits, and thereby the principle by which reason itself even has a limit. As Morisato observes regarding reason's self-critique, in order for it to be a thorough self-criticism, it requires something other than itself. And you should go look at his book, Faith and Reason, which is more thoroughly explicating Tanabe in relation to William Desmond. The absolute appears as other power, as a power other than reason, that strikes down the being of the concept. Because the absolute leaves reason in a state of contradiction, reason finds itself saddled with a false concept of the absolute. Because reason is powerless to conceptually grasp the absolute is great beyond all measure. However, this is nothing less than the sublime. As Kant defines it, the sublime is the infinitely great, which exceeds all measures. The absolute here appears as the sublime. It's not in Kant's sense, but if we want to talk about how it's different from Kant, this is also something interesting to discuss. To summarize, the absolute is other power, as that which negates reason and therefore appears as a sublime contradiction. Because the absolute is the power of the negation or resistance, it not only resists conceptual form, but its absolute character is constituted by its resistance to all forms of relativity. The absolute, always and again, resists relative being. Tanabe reminds us that the relative is always opposed to the relative, but the absolute stands in opposition to nothing. Whenever one attempts to confine it by any form, whether conceptual, imaginative, or sensual, one relativizes it. The absolute is always other than the relative, that which breaks out of relative form. Thus, we should be careful to note that other power transcends more than just conceptual form. It transcends all form. It's just that we intellectuals are obsessed with concepts, so I'm just kind of hyper-focusing on this. However, if the absolute is other power, and the absolute has no opposition, and it is all-encompassing and transrational, then there should be no room for reason to exist at all. However, rationality certainly exists. We can only recognize the absolute to be transrational because we recognize what it is to be rational. Indeed, we could not recognize the absolute as a contradiction without being already acquainted with the being of rationality as governed by the principle of non-contradiction. By thinking the absolute as a contradiction, everything appears to be irrational in form. However, if there were no rationality at all, there would be nothing for the transrational to transcend, and consequently nothing transrational would exist either. The very fact of the transrational depends on the being of the rational. And given that the rational exists, it must be possible. Accordingly, a new question arises. How is it even possible for the rational to be? Tanabe's central question is not only what is the origin of the limit of reason, but also how is it even possible for the rational agent to exist at all? Other power is that in virtue of which the limit between the rational and the transrational is drawn. However, we must remember that reason as a relative non-absolute being is finite. Finitude means that something is inherently limited. Indeed, there is a limit internal to reason, for the rational agent encounters that limit in their very failure to perform the critique of pure reason on their rational power alone, and the experience of that limit is an experience of the finitude of reason itself. Because other power is that in virtue of which the limit of reason must be drawn, and the limit of reason is internal to reason itself, other power must itself be responsible for the very being of reason as a limited being. Other power makes it possible for the rational to be. The rational agent exists, but by any rational measure, it should not. None of us, as rational beings, should be. For the absolute is absolutely transrational. The fact that any rational agent exists is simply a miracle. It is in virtue of other power, of course, that any rational agent exists, though how this existence is possible, how other power gives rationality being, remains completely inexplicable to reason. In Tanabe's words, it is in virtue of the grace and compassion of other power that the rational agent, indeed any finite being, exists. Thus, Tanabe describes other power as the great compassion. See, we're also in Buddhist territory here. Hence, other power is the great nay as the great compassion, not just the great nay, by which any rational agent is able to exist, despite the fact that by any rational measure it should not be here. The great nay of absolute nothingness as absolute transformation becomes great compassion. It's a quote from Tanabe. The experience of the very existence of one's own reason and the bottomlessness of its very origin in other power should be a profoundly religious experience, for it demands an acceptance of what transcends reason. Nevertheless, this religious experience is not opposed to the rational life, but is a consequence of the very attempt to rationally critique one's own reason by means of reason alone. Through the failure to critique reason by its self-power alone, the philosopher experiences the absolute as the power that transcends reason, the other power in virtue of which the very limitation of being a reason exists. Murai puts it well, quote, Tanabe attempted to accept the rift between knowledge and reality, and to find in this rift space for these two poles to relate to each other. That's where all the difficulty is. Having walked the path from absolute critique to other power, we should not forget that Tanabe's text is entitled Philosophy of Metanoetics. Metanoetics not only implies the transcendence of nous, but a change of character, a turning of the soul, to use Plato's expression, that is implied by that transcendence. The change of heart initiated by the great nay has strong implications for our anthropomorphic tendencies in thinking. From Tanabe's perspectives, it would be profoundly anthropomorphic to expect the absolute to be rational. To expect the absolute should conform to the structure of human reason would constitute a prejudicial projection of human life onto the absolute. Certainly it is more common to regard mythical and religious views as anthropocentric, and admittedly they usually are. However, anthropomorphic these may be, the point of view that says the absolute is knowable by means of human reason, whether this be scientific or philosophical in kind, may be just as hyper-anthropomorphic as any mythological or religious point of view. Rather than expect the absolute to conform to our reason, Tanabe's experience of the sublimity of other power arguably repels all forms of anthropocentrism. Because there is no path to overcome the contradiction, and there is absolutely no reason to hope for a true concept that would correspond to the absolute, the philosopher cannot succeed in conceptualizing it. The contradiction destroys all concepts. It destroys the possibility of their truth. Rather than hope for a conceptual formula of the absolute, one day we're going to get it. We're really going to have it. No, you're never going to have it. You should just give up on that now. Right? A philosophy that is aware of itself must stand in despair. There is no hope for a conceptual formula of the absolute. Through perpetual failure to think the absolute, the philosopher should be humbled before it. The philosopher should recognize the hopelessness of absolute knowledge. But don't worry, we're not going to end there. Can't end in hopelessness. However, because the absolute is experienced as sublime, the hopelessness of conceptual knowledge does not exhaust the emotive experience of the absolute. Rather, other power has a positive aesthetic dimension, which, as I already mentioned, corresponds to its sublime character. Because the absolute is sublime, the philosopher stands in awe before it. One stands in awe before an awesome power. The sublime power is awesome because it's powerful. As such, it is awful. This is a nice play in the English language. Awful, awesome. As Americans, I love to say awesome. We always say that, we never mean it, really. But in this case, I actually mean it. The awesome is awful. It has the capacity to destroy the form by which you approach it. What is more, because one stands in awe before such a power that exceeds, overpowers, and overwhelms reason, one shrinks in the face of it. Even though it's nothing a nothing that exceeds all forms, a sublime and awesome nothing. To be sure, this is a contradiction, but it is that inevitable contradiction that is itself the source of awe. The absolute is nothing, and therefore has no power, and yet it is the sublime power that puts an end to all conceptual formula. Finally, we should also acknowledge that to stand in awe is quite different from just wondering. For wondering implies the possibility of fulfilling your wonder with knowledge, and to thereby exhaust it. The other power is an inexhaustible power that negates the possibility of rational knowledge. One cannot wonder at the absolute qua other power. One can be in awe of it, but that's different from wondering. However, the metanoetic transformation demands more than despair, humility, and awe. Above all, it calls for a confession of wrongdoing and repentance. Insofar as the philosopher originally assumes the absolute has rational form, the philosopher has committed an epistemic error. Further, the philosopher has committed a great act of vanity. They've modeled the absolute on their own form of thinking. Having learned that the absolute transcends reason, the philosopher should have remorse for their vain egoism, remorse for their presupposition that the world has the form of human reason, or even worse, maybe a particular kind of reason located culturally in a certain place, space, or time. Because the philosopher has the inherent desire and tendency to absolutize reason, they naturally tend to absolutize themselves. And this vanity leads to suffering. For the striving cannot achieve its goal. It's impossible for the philosopher to succeed. Thus, this vanity is terrible. It causes much suffering. The philosopher should confess their wrongdoing and acknowledge their responsibility for seeking after the impossible and the suffering it generates. I think Tanabe himself is doing that in the book. Moreover, so he's talking about himself, not just like, you guys got to do it, but he's like really confessing his own vanity as he goes through this. Not just with philosophy, but there's other things going on as well. You can ask Takeshi about later. The philosopher is called to repent, sangha, for their striving to absolutize reason when it cannot be absolutized. The philosopher is called to repent for their false rationalism and to convert to a new way of thinking and being, a repentance that is itself made possible by other power. The philosopher is called to see the absolute as it is, as other power, the sublime contradiction. Finally, the philosopher is called to thankfulness for other power, specifically for the fact that they exist at all, when by the light of reason they should not exist and should not be able to. In short, quote, reason is restored to salvation through transcendent grace, so that in its metanoesis it repents for its sins, acknowledges itself as presumptuous and guilty of self-reliance, and awakens to its own finitude. Close quote. All right, from absolute critique to absolute mediation. We're going to recover reason now. In addition to the concept of other power, the practice of absolute critique also engenders the concept of absolute mediation. For Tanabe, absolute mediation entails that human reason is the means by which the trans-rational absolute, or other power, is revealed. However, this seems to be at odds with this position that reason cannot know the absolute. So, in order to grasp how Tanabe can hold both positions simultaneously, we have to reconsider the failure of reason to know the absolute. So there are two fundamental ways, maybe there are more, but there are at least two that I want to consider here, of thinking about reason's failure to know the absolute. One can consider reason's inability to conceptualize the absolute to be a pure failure. However, if reason were only a failure, we would learn nothing from our failure to conceptualize the absolute. However, our failure to conceive the absolute teaches us something, that the absolute is transrational. Thus, while reason fails to conceptualize the absolute, it cannot be deemed a pure failure. The success of reason cannot, however, consist in the successful correspondence of a concept or concepts or judgments with the absolute, since the absolute transcends all concepts and judgments. Naturally, one could continue to attempt to make the concept correspond to the absolute, to make the square fit the circle. However, because no concept can successfully correspond to it, Tanabe is adamant that such hope is foolhardy. The only insight that such efforts afford is that no concept is able to correspond to it. Without an account of the success of reason, we cannot understand Tanabe's commitment to the view that other power employs the agency of reason, or reason's self-power, as a means by which it reveals itself and reconciles itself with reason. If other power were always simply other to reason, if reason were outside of other power could not be absolute. It would exclude something and would be relative to something else. If reason were merely a failure, then it would be completely outside other power. Nevertheless, reason cannot be absolutely outside of other power, or else other power would not be the absolute. To put it paradoxically, since other power is both absolute and transrational, and nothing is outside the absolute, reason too must be transrational. Otherwise, neither it nor other power could be. If reason exists, reason must be resurrected as transrational. What does it mean, however, for reason to be resurrected as transrational? And how can this be accomplished? Every time the philosopher raises their concepts to the absolute, it results in contradiction and thereby falsifies their concepts. And yet a truth is revealed in virtue of that failure. Only through the failure of reason and its self-power can it be revealed to the philosopher that the absolute transcends our capacity to reason. The failure of reason is thereby a necessary vehicle by which the absolute is revealed to be other power, the power other to reason, the transrational. So that's the success of reason. That's why Tanabe is a rationalist. In short, reason itself is the means by which other power is revealed. Other power is revealed as that which transcends reason only by means of reason and its failure. You won't even know what it means to say that that the absolute transcends reason if you haven't thought a lot about what it is to reason. Only reason can truly know what it is to be transrational, for it is in virtue of reason that we know what rationality is. And only because we know what reason is can we know what it would be to exceed this capacity. Because other power transcends every concept, no concept can be true of it, not even the concepts of other power, the absolute or transrational themselves. The experience of failing to grasp the absolute is nothing less than an encounter with the other power that is not other power. Other power is revealed as the power other to reason only in virtue of reason attempting to grasp the absolute and failing to grasp it, thereby experiencing the contradiction, the opposites falling into unity. Something that is contradictory transcends itself. Other power is that which is always other to itself and which transcends every concept of the other. So other power even transcends the concept of other power. And you have to see that, otherwise you don't see it as other power or understand it as other power. By witnessing the absolute fall into contradiction, the absolute is revealed as that which transcends itself. Indeed, reason succeeds as a means of knowing the absolute, but it can only succeed by failing. Only through error can the absolute be revealed as other power. There's a lot of also in the 20th century in continental philosophy, there's a lot of parallels to this kind of idea. Only through error can the absolute be revealed as other power. For the conceptualizing mind, the absolute can only exist in a contradictory form. Existing explicitly as contradictory is a way for it to be. To put it simply and paradoxically, the infinite contradiction is the conceptual formula of the absolute. Because reason is the means by which other power is revealed as other power, and because other power is responsible for the fact and existence of reason, the revelation of other power via reason is other power's revelation of itself. Hence, reason does not exist somewhere beyond other power. This is a very German idealistic moment here. There's also one reason I really like it. Rather, reason is within the power of other power. It is the power of other power by virtue of which the absolute can be other to reason. Reason is being as upaya. It is empty of absolutely independent existence and the relative being by means of which other power reveals itself as other power. In the metanoetic conversion, reason is reconciled with other power, for it is constituted transrationally. Other power is immanent in reason itself. As Tanabe writes, contradictions do not thereby cease to be contradictions, so they're not resolved, but restore reason to a transrational dimension where it can serve as a mediator to or collaborator in the transformative activity of the absolute. Almost done here. Tanabe affirms the life of reason in a transfigured form. Reason can successfully reveal the absolute only on the condition that it no longer attempt to overcome this contradiction. Philosophy's metanoetics lets the absolute contradiction be, allows it to remain. Philosophy succeeds when it reveals the power of other power as that which destroys its own concepts. Philosophical thinking cannot help but destroy itself, and it is exactly this self-destruction in virtue of which other power reconciles itself with reason. Reason, whose very nature is to be dialectical, is self-negating, and can exist only in the mediation and resurrection effected through its self-negation and self-destruction. Because reason itself reveals the transrational, and the transrational requires the being of reason in order to be that which transcends reason, reason is not only the means by which the transrational is revealed, it is also the means by which the absolute is able to exist as that which is transrational, that is, as that which is other to reason. Because other power is the origin of reason, and reason is a necessary means for the absolute to be other power is responsible for its own existence as other power. In other words, it's self-determining. Although other power is absolutely independent, other power seems, well, it's also nothing. For this reason, how can it have its own agency? The only way other power can draw the limit between reason and the transrational is, as then Tanabe says, so he's always, I ask the question and then he answers it, by relying upon the agency of something else, such as human agency. As is evident, absolute critique is inherently dialectical, for other power draws the limit by means of the power of the human self. Other power is not just other power. In absolute mediation, the absolute is mediated by human agency, such that metanoetics is the way of salvation through other power qua self-power. It's other power qua self-power. So he says it's other power, and then he qualifies it qua self-power. That's another moment of the contradiction there. Although other power is all-encompassing and includes rational inquiry within itself, other power is not simply identical to the rational self. This is very important. For Tanabe, other power is not simply the rational agency. Rational agency is not identical to other power. The failure of the rational agency to live up to the absolute is an irreducible fact that reflects an irreducible difference between one's own agency and other power. The non-identity, the rift between the self and the absolute, is constitutive of other power and the rational agency alike. Ironically, by ceasing to close the gap, by living into the rift, one is reconciled with the absolute. Tanabe is always careful to emphasize that although the self plays the role of mediator, the self is not deified. It is a vehicle of other power, not other power itself. This is going to be arguably a difference with Nietzsche, with Nietzsche. Although the rational agent is not identical to other power, neither is the rational agent outside other power. The rational agent is other than, but not beyond other power. This is close to Schelling's view in the Freedom essay as well, but we can talk about that later if people are interested. Okay, final section, the allegorical structure of reason. Absolute critique seems to transform concepts into something like an allegory. This is at least indicated by the fact that an allegory, or at least this word, means something like speech about something else. And every concept of the absolute points beyond itself. The allegorical transformation of concepts assumes a transformation of the concept of truth itself. So you might wonder, what is the concept of truth here? That's operative. Because Tanabe makes many claims about the absolute in philosophy's metanoetics, and everything that the philosopher proclaims about other power is false, since it transcends all forms, all of Tanabe's claims about the absolute are false. Rather than endanger Tanabe's position, it is exactly what Tanabe affirms. When Tanabe proclaims the absolute to be other power, he is opposing other power to self-power. Because the absolute is not relative to anything, and other power is absolute, other power is relative to nothing, not even self-power. Tanabe's proclamation that the absolute is other power is not true. If the correspondence of the concept, I don't mean that as a critique, if the correspondence of the concept of other power with the absolute is what the proposition, the absolute is other power, signifies, the proposition, the absolute is other power, cannot be true. In this sense, it is false that the absolute is other power. If this is the case, how can one experience the truth of the absolute as other power? Only by experiencing the self-destruction of the proposition, the absolute is other power, can one glean insight into the truth of the absolute as other power. I've said this a couple times, but I keep saying it, but I think it's actually very important to see that he contradicts himself on purpose, and that's part of the whole point. Okay, so if you've read this and you're used to it, it's fine, but if you're not, then it's a bit strange. It's a move you see in other Western thinkers too. We can talk about similarities. Once one recognizes that all propositions about the absolute destroy themselves and cannot be the case, the concept of other power points beyond itself to that which transcends the concept. Only then is one in a position to experience other power as other power. One can only witness other power as other power through the destruction of one's concept of other power. Hence, Tanabe cannot hold that his concepts of the absolute do correspond to the absolute while others fail. Tanabe himself fails. That's really important to the metanoetics, a failure that philosophy as metanoetics explicitly acknowledges. So the truth of other power cannot be understood in terms of a correspondence between concept and object. So it's not a correspondence theory of truth. Therefore, Tanabe cannot advocate for a correspondence theory. In addition, it's not a coherence theory because other power is self-contradictory. So if you wanted to take an intro to epistemology textbook and you wanted to, which is not a good idea, and try to put Tanabe in a little box, it's probably not a good idea. It's not going to work. But what's the theory of truth then? In contrast to these theories of truth, Tanabe arguably employs, and this is me kind of speculating a bit, we can talk about it, a concept of truth that's in the spirit of Heidegger, who understood truth as the disclosure of something hidden. In this case, truth is the revelation or the coming out of hiddenness, aletheia, of what remained concealed. In absolute critique, we are forced to encounter the contradiction. We can't make it disappear except by ceasing to think about the absolute. One can say that such contradictions are true in the sense that the absolute is disclosed as contradictory, not in the sense that my concept corresponds with it, but that what is revealed is the destruction of my reason or something. In that sense, the contradiction is true. So it's different from saying it's true because there's a correspondence or something like that. The contradiction is true, for it is what steps out of hiddenness. It's what is revealed in the attempt to critique reason. The transconceptual absolute is revealed through the clearing away of the concept, judgment, and syllogism. That's the clearing. The truth of the absolute as other power is not only a revelation of what was hidden, but a non-conceptual disclosure. In fact, the failure of the correspondence theory of truth itself points in this direction. By failing to correlate my concept with the absolute, truth as non-conceptual disclosure of the absolute as other power is revealed. Indeed, even the truth that concepts correspond with objects seems to demand that concepts themselves first be revealed and come out of hiddenness themselves, which is something that Heidegger points out. By destroying themselves and proving the falsehood of the correspondence theory of truth, they point to the truth as that which transcends concepts. Truth itself is revealed to be a non-conceptual disclosure, and when one witnesses that, one has really performed or lived through the critique of pure reason. One's reason is resurrected, but now as a kind of allegory. Everything relative seems to be a kind of allegory insofar as it points beyond itself to something else. Because allegory is a speech about something other than what is said, Tanabe endorses a kind of allegorical reading of conceptual thought. Tanabe resurrects logic in this way. Concepts have an allegorical truth insofar as they point to the non-conceptual, that which is other than what they signify. Because the concept of the absolute is true only insofar it points beyond everything signified by the concept, Tanabe quotes Goethe's Faust. I'll read a few lines from Faust here. Alles Vergängliche ist nur ein Gleichnis. Das Unzulängliche, hier wird Ereignis. Das Unbeschreibliche, hier ist getan. Das ewige Weibliche zieht uns hinan. We don't need to talk about all those lines. It's a beautiful line from Goethe's Faust. If you're German, you go through the education system. Everybody has to learn Faust. That's just what you do. It's like you should be learning Shakespeare, I guess, if you go through school here, I think, maybe. Or
You guess.
do you get Shakespeare here?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's like, that's the Germans are to Faust, the English are to, or I don't know, the British are to Shakespeare. I don't want to say the wrong thing here. Having recognized that it is the allegorical power of reason, in urge which the philosopher can give witness to other power, one can more fully appreciate Tanabe's defense of the life of reason against its antagonist. So everything that passes, alles Vergängliche ist nur eine Gleichnis. Everything that passes is only an appearance or a likeness. Everything is a likeness. So it's like the bird flies and is like a bird. I think it was one of these things. So the bird is like a bird. And this is, I think, the idea that Tanabe is finding in the German text. Okay. Tanabe's formula of action, faith, witness, this is the very last two paragraphs, so it went a little longer. Tanabe's formula of action, faith, witness offers a fitting summation of the logic of metanoetics. Absolute critique demands an act of reason. And through the act of reason, the philosopher gives witness and testimony to the truth of other power, the act through which it makes the rational life possible. Finally, because rational agency only exists in virtue of other power, the philosopher trusts in other power. This trust in other power is born from the fact that the philosopher witnesses the action of other power, its miraculous power in virtue of which reason itself exists. This trust in other power is a kind of religious experience. However, it is a religious experience born by the activity of reason and the subsequent experience of the limit of that reason. One cannot rationally account for the fact of reason, but one can give witness to the miraculous power of other power to draw the limit of reason. In short, religious experience or the reliance upon faith should not require one to abandon the life of reason. Indeed, philosophy itself is religious practice, or is a religious practice. That's a cool idea. In conclusion, even if it's not true, Tanabe's practice of absolute critique, I mean, I'm really drawn to it, so I'm not going to throw it out, but I think its challenges are kind of dogmatic approaches to religion, what rational life involves. Religion within the bounds of mere reason. Maybe not. In conclusion, Tanabe's practice of absolute critique executes and attempts to complete the critique of pure reason in his own way. Tanabe's execution and completion transforms the critique of pure reason into a philosophy of other power, in which the rational self functions as a mediator for the absolute. Rather than oppose reason and religious experience, absolute critique weds the rational life with religious experience, thereby reconciling philosophy and religion. To be sure, Tanabe's philosophy relies upon faith, but this faith could only be born and sustained by an unshakable commitment to the systematic character of reason, a reason that inevitably points beyond itself to the trans-rational absolute. Thanks a lot.